What if there was a story about Jesus that was never supposed to survive? A story so unsettling, so intimate, that early leaders did everything they could to bury it beneath centuries of silence. Imagine a gospel whispered only in shadows, a record of moments too raw, too human, too powerful for the world of that time to accept. A story not lost, but deliberately hidden. And now, after nearly 2,000 years, those forgotten words are resurfacing. Words that challenge everything we thought we knew. Words that make us ask, if this story brought people closer to Jesus, why would anyone want it erased? Before we open this forbidden chapter of history, take a breath, because once you hear what was hidden, you'll never look at the story of Jesus the same way again. And if you're ready to go deeper into mysteries like this, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. Welcome to Hidden Genesis. For years, scholars believed that every important story about Jesus had already been written, that the four Gospels were the complete picture, the full testimony, the final word. But history has a way of holding secrets long after people try to erase them, and this particular secret begins not with a miracle, not with a prophecy, but with a man, a disciple whose name never made it into the official Bible, not because he wasn't there, not because he didn't follow Jesus, but because what he saw, what he heard, and what he wrote didn't fit the version of the story early leaders wanted the world to know. Most disciples wrote for communities. They wrote to teach, to explain, to spread the message. But this man wrote for one reason. He believed the world deserved to know the real Jesus, the Jesus behind the crowds, behind the sermons, behind the miracles. And so he wrote what he remembered, the things others were too afraid to say. Not to shame Jesus, not to diminish him, but to show the depth of his humanity, the part that made him relatable, vulnerable, and painfully real. He described moments the public never saw, nights when Jesus walked alone through the hills because he couldn't sleep, when the weight of his mission pressed so heavily on him that his hands shook as he prayed. Days when Jesus questioned whether people were truly ready for what he came to bring, when he doubted if humanity could understand love as deeply as he offered it. He wrote about the quiet conversations, spoken far from crowds and miracles. Conversations where Jesus confessed fears, shared hopes, and revealed truths that sounded far too disruptive for the world of that time. This disciple claimed that Jesus didn't just preach love. He wrestled with the cost of giving it. He didn't just speak of sacrifice. He felt the fear of it. He didn't just heal the broken. He carried the burden of knowing not everyone wanted to be healed. Imagine how dangerous that would sound to leaders trying to build a structured, unified, unquestioned faith. A Jesus who struggled, a Jesus who questioned, a Jesus who felt overwhelmed. To them, that wasn't inspiring. It was destabilizing. So the disciples' writings were quietly pushed aside, not burned, not destroyed, just hidden, placed in a small community of believers who were told, guard this, but do not share it. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Languages evolved. Rulers changed the world with swords and laws. But somewhere, tucked inside a wooden box sealed with resin, the forbidden memories of an unnamed disciple waited. Imagine the silence of that cave, the heat, the darkness, the untouched stillness of time itself. Inside that box remained the portrait of a Jesus who was not distant, not unreachable, not untouchable, but heartbreakingly close to what we are. And that leads to a question viewers can't escape. If seeing the humanity of Jesus makes us feel closer to him, why would anyone want to hide it? Why would a story meant to bring people into his heart be locked away for nearly 2,000 years? What were early leaders afraid of? And what exactly did this disciple write that made his voice too dangerous to include in the official story? For almost 2,000 years, The writings of the unnamed disciple were believed to be lost forever, if they ever existed at all. Generations lived and died, never knowing that somewhere, beneath layers of sand and silence, a story slept untouched. But history rarely hides forever, and sometimes it reveals its secrets at the moment the world is finally prepared to face them. The discovery began far away from Jerusalem, in a remote corner of Egypt. A team of archaeologists, tired, dusty, and on the verge of giving up, noticed something strange. A thin fracture in a rock wall, barely big enough to slip a hand through. At first, it looked like nothing, just another crack in another forgotten cave. But when they cleared the debris and widened the opening, chilled air poured out. Air that hadn't been touched by the world since the early centuries of Christianity. Inside the cave, their flashlights caught something unexpected. Not gold, not pottery, not royal treasures, but a single wooden box. The box was sealed with hardened resin, wrapped in linen that turned to dust at the slightest touch. And for a moment, just a moment, nobody dared to breathe. Because boxes like this didn't belong to tombs or markets or soldiers. They belonged to scribes, to monks, to guardians of secrets. When the archaeologists finally opened it, they found a stack of brittle pages, darkened with age, written in an ancient form of Greek and Coptic. The handwriting was uneven, emotional, almost urgent, as if the writer didn't have much time and needed to finish before someone found him. And then the real shock came. The first line wasn't a title, it wasn't a dedication, it wasn't even a name. It was a confession. Words that trembling hands once wrote. I write this because memory is all that will remain, and love demands I do not let it die. Those words hit scholars like a bolt of lightning. Who wrote this? Who was so afraid that he believed memory itself was in danger of dying? What love was he talking about? What truth was so fragile it needed to be hidden in a cave for safekeeping? As the scholars began to translate the fragments, one detail became painfully clear. This wasn't a sermon. This wasn't a theological argument. This was a witness, a disciple speaking directly from the heart. Someone who walked beside Jesus. Someone who knew him closely, intimately, deeply. Someone who saw what others didn't dare write. And the tone of the writings? It wasn't formal. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't polished. It was raw. It was honest. It felt like someone whispering their last truth before the world swallowed it. The more the team translated, the more uneasy they grew. Not because the writings contradicted the Bible, but because they expanded it. They revealed a Jesus who was even more compassionate, more fragile, more determined, and more complex than anyone expected. But there was something else. Something hidden beneath the lines. Something the scholar leading the translation noticed before anyone else. This writer wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for the message, afraid that the truth he carried would be twisted, controlled, or forgotten. The scholar, who had spent his entire career studying early Christian manuscripts, lifted his head from the pages and whispered, "This author didn't just write a gospel, he wrote a warning. A warning that the world would never be told everything. A warning that some truths would be softened, trimmed, or completely removed. A warning that certain teachings of Jesus were considered too explosive to survive the politics of the early church. And the most haunting question, if this disciple's memories were so important that someone risked their life to hide them, why were they hidden in the first place? What was inside these pages that made ancient leaders decide this cannot be shared? What did they fear? What truth about Jesus was powerful enough to be buried? The fragments found in that wooden box didn't begin with miracles. They didn't begin with crowds. They didn't even begin with teachings. They began with a moment so private, so human, that scholars at first believed it had to be a mistake. The unnamed disciple wrote, "I came upon him alone, and I knew he did not want to be seen. But I could not turn away, for his sorrow was greater than any man I had ever known." It was a moment no gospel mentions. A moment that didn't happen on a mountaintop or beside the sea or in the presence of thousands. It happened in silence, in stillness, in exhaustion. He described Jesus sitting by himself at the edge of a dried riverbed, his hands covering his face as though trying to hide a grief that had no name. Not fear, not despair, but sorrow. A sorrow that comes from loving the world more than the world wants to be loved. The disciple wrote that Jesus didn't hear him approach, that Jesus' shoulders trembled and his breath was uneven, as though he had carried too much for too long. And then, for the first time in any ancient text, a disciple described Jesus saying words that stunned modern translators. How can I teach them the kingdom when they do not yet understand their own hearts? He wasn't doubting his mission. He wasn't questioning God. He was heartbroken for humanity, for our stubbornness, our blindness, our resistance to change. This Jesus wasn't distant. He wasn't made of stone. He wasn't untouched by human struggle. He felt it deeply. The disciple continued, describing a conversation that felt almost too sacred to read. Jesus confessed that people listened to his words with their ears but refused to open their hearts. He said his greatest fear wasn't death, but being misunderstood by those he came to save. Imagine reading that for the first time. Imagine realizing that the Messiah himself worried that his message would be twisted, softened, or ignored. The disciple wrote that Jesus looked up at him, eyes tired yet fierce, and said, "They seek miracles, but they do not seek understanding. They want signs, but they do not want transformation." This was the part that early leaders might have found alarming, not because it contradicted anything, but because it revealed a Jesus who challenged not only sinners, but believers too. A Jesus who wasn't simply a comforter, but a mirror, showing people the truth about themselves, even when they didn't want to see it. And then came the passage that scholars believe sealed this gospel's fate. The disciple wrote, "He told me that many would use his name, but not his heart, that many would build temples, but forget the purpose of love, that many would speak of God while refusing to see God in their brother." Those words struck like a blade, because they weren't aimed at the Romans, or the Pharisees, or the critics. They were aimed at his own future followers. A warning, a prophecy, a painful truth he knew the world wasn't ready for. This chapter of the Lost Gospel didn't show a weakened Jesus. It showed a Jesus so emotionally connected to humanity that he felt the weight of our struggles as if they were his own. And the disciple's final sentence in this fragment, it still haunts modern researchers. He carried not only the cross, but the heartbreak of watching those he loved refuse to love one another. That was the truth someone tried to bury. A truth not about miracles, but about the emotional, human cost of being a savior in a world reluctant to be saved. These were moments the world was never meant to read, but now that they've surfaced, they raise a question impossible to ignore. If Jesus shared these fears, these wounds, these intimate confessions, who decided the world shouldn't hear them? And what else was hidden? The next set of fragments shocked everyone who studied them. Not because they contradicted the Bible, but because they went far deeper than anything the early church wanted circulating among new believers. These weren't public teachings. These were the late-night conversations, the small circle lessons, the truths Jesus shared only with those he trusted most. And they were dangerous. Not in a political sense, but in a transformational sense. They didn't tell followers what to believe. They asked them who they were willing to become. One fragment began with a sentence that caught scholars off guard. "The kingdom is not a place you go, it is the person you choose to be." Imagine how threatening that idea would feel to religious leaders trying to build structure, rules, systems, and institutions. A kingdom that lived inside the believer, not inside a temple. A kingdom built by transformation, not tradition. A kingdom that didn't wait for death, but demanded change in life. This was not a message that could be controlled, it was a message that empowered. The gospel described Jesus teaching something rarely written down, that the greatest battlefield wasn't Rome, or the synagogue, or the world outside. It was the human heart. He told his close followers that before they could preach love, they had to face the parts of themselves they refused to acknowledge, their pride, their jealousy, their desire to be important, their fear of losing control. The disciple wrote, he said to us, "You wish to lead others, but you have not learned to lead your own spirit." These were not comforting words, they were confrontational. They stripped away ego, position, and status. Perhaps that is why this gospel was kept silent, because these teachings didn't grant authority to the leaders. They placed responsibility on every believer. Jesus told them, "The one who changes himself changes the world more than the one who commands thousands." In another passage, he warned, "Many will speak in my name, but speak from their fear, not from love. Their words will build crowds, but not hearts." Imagine the weight of that statement. Imagine how many leaders, even centuries later, would feel accused by it. But the most startling teaching came from a conversation recorded between Jesus and the unnamed disciple alone. Jesus asked him, "Tell me, when you look at a stranger, do you see a man, or do you see yourself?" The disciple said he didn't understand. Jesus replied, "There is no distance between you and your brother, except the distance you place there." This teaching, simple, direct, radical, was the very heart of his message. A message that threatened any system built on separation, hierarchy, or power. If the kingdom lived inside every person, if every stranger was another self, if transformation was personal, internal, and unstoppable, then no institution could claim to own God. No council could control salvation. No authority could stand between a person and heaven. This was the part that frightened early leaders. Not because they disagreed with Jesus, but because these teachings made their ability to control the message almost impossible. If the kingdom is within, who needs a gatekeeper? If God is found in the stranger, who can claim superiority? If transformation is personal, who can dictate the path? The unnamed disciple wrote these things down because he believed Jesus wanted this truth preserved, even if the world wasn't ready for it. And that truth was this: Jesus didn't come to build an institution. He came to build individuals. He didn't come to create followers. He came to awaken sons and daughters. He didn't come to give people a religion. He came to give them themselves. This was the message that threatened the early power structures. This was the message easier to hide than to explain. This was the message buried in a cave for nearly 2 millennia. And yet, this was only the beginning of what the lost gospel revealed. Because the disciple didn't just record teachings, he recorded conflict, real conflict, the kind that made powerful men decide, this must never be read. Until this point in the lost gospel, everything written was deeply personal. Quiet moments, private teachings, the human side of Jesus no one else had dared to record. But then, the tone changed. The disciples' writing shifted from reflection to urgency, from memory to warning. Something had happened. Something that made him realize these teachings might never survive unless he hid them. He described a moment shortly after Jesus shared some of his most intimate lessons with the smaller circle of believers. Word had begun to spread that Jesus was teaching things privately, things he wasn't saying to the crowds. And that made some of the early leaders uneasy. The disciple wrote, "They asked him why he taught us what he did not teach them. They feared being left behind. They feared losing influence." There it was. The first spark of conflict. Not against Jesus, but between Jesus' own followers. Some believed that leadership meant proximity, that the closer they were to Jesus physically, the more authority they deserved spiritually. But Jesus saw no hierarchy among his followers, and that infuriated a few. The disciple described a tense gathering, a night when Jesus stood before a small group of leaders and spoke words that struck at the heart of their ambitions. He said, "If you seek to lead men, your heart is not yet free." The room went silent. Some bowed their heads, others clenched their jaws, and a few exchanged glances filled with resentment. The disciple wrote that one of them, a respected organizer, someone trusted, someone influential, stood and asked, "Are we not chosen to guide the people? Is that not our place?" Jesus answered plainly, "No man is born above another, for the kingdom raises the lowly and humbles the proud." That statement shook them, because it meant that authority, rank and influence, all the things they thought they were earning, meant nothing in the kingdom Jesus spoke of. Jesus added, "The one who wishes to rule has not yet understood love." That was the moment, according to the disciple, when a quiet division formed. Not out of hate, not out of betrayal, but out of pride. Some felt threatened, some felt exposed, some felt Jesus was granting too much spiritual freedom to people they saw as unqualified. And then came the passage that scholars now believe sealed the fate of this gospel forever. The disciple recorded Jesus saying, "There will come those who speak in my name but do not carry my heart. They will protect their place and call it protecting the truth." It was a prophecy, a warning, a mirror held up to the very men who would later decide which writings would be preserved and which would be forgotten. The disciple wrote that after Jesus made this declaration, some leaders left the room in anger, not because they hated Jesus, but because they could not accept a future where they held no special position. It was after this conflict that the disciple realized what he had to do. He wrote, "I saw then that the words he spoke would be changed to comfort those who feared losing place, so I wrote what others would not write." That line, that single line, explains why this gospel was hidden, not burned, not erased, hidden, because these teachings didn't empower the leaders. They empowered the people. They didn't strengthen institutions. They strengthened individuals. They didn't elevate authority. They elevated the heart. The disciple even confessed his fear. They will soften his warnings and harden his gentleness. What he spoke for all, they will claim for themselves. Imagine how explosive that would be in the earliest days of Christianity, when unity was fragile and leadership was fiercely debated. A gospel that exposed the human struggle for power within the first generation of believers was more dangerous than any attack from outsiders. So the decision was made, quietly, privately, firmly. These writings must be set aside, not because they were false, but because they were too honest, too raw, too revealing, too threatening to the rising structure of the early church. And so the disciple hid them, not out of rebellion, but out of love, because he believed the world would one day be ready for the whole story, and whether he knew it or not, he was right, because the rest of his writing reveals how this gospel survived when it should have been lost forever. If you've followed the story this far, you know one thing clearly. This gospel wasn't lost by accident. It was hidden on purpose. But the surprising truth is this: it didn't disappear because one disciple tucked it away. It survived because generation after generation risked everything to keep it alive. The disciple who first wrote it knew what he was doing. He knew the political climate. He knew the tension among early leaders. He knew the fierce debates over doctrine, authority, and control. He also knew how fragile truth becomes when men begin to fear it. So he hid the manuscript, not in a temple, not in a synagogue, not in a public place where it could be seized, but in a small, humble community of believers who followed Jesus quietly, devoted not to structure, but to spirit. This community wasn't large. It wasn't wealthy. It didn't seek influence. They were simple people who believed that the words of Jesus belonged to every heart, not just the chosen few. The disciple entrusted the manuscript to them and left behind one plea: "Guard this not for yourselves, but for those who will one day need it more than we do." And from that moment on, the gospel began a journey that no one could have predicted. It passed from hand to hand, home to home, generation to generation, often carried by people whose names history never recorded. There were times when the manuscript came close to being lost forever. One fragment describes a period of persecution when followers of Jesus were hunted, their writings seized, their gatherings broken apart. During that time, the guardian of the manuscript was a young woman, barely 20 years old, who wrapped the fragile text in cloth and hid it beneath the floorboards of a bakery. While soldiers stormed through the streets, she stood at the doorway with flour on her clothes, holding her breath, praying the footsteps would pass. They did, and the gospel survived. Years later, another guardian, a wanderer, a teacher, someone who never stayed in one place long enough to be caught, carried the manuscript across the desert in a leather pouch. He traveled alone. He told no one what he protected. He wrote in his journal, "If I am captured, let the sand take me," but not the words. He died in a small village, but before he passed, he gave the manuscript to a family who kept it safe for decades, never fully understanding its importance, only knowing it was sacred. Eventually, the manuscript found its way to a small monastic community in Egypt. These monks lived in isolation. They kept few possessions, but they valued one thing above all else: preserving the words of early believers. When they received the manuscript, they recognized immediately that it was unlike anything they had seen. It was emotional, it was intimate, it was honest. Too honest. They understood why it had been hidden. But they also understood its value. They didn't dare destroy it, but they didn't dare release it either. So they protected it the only way they knew how. They sealed it in a wooden box, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a cave. A place where no kingdom, no soldier, no council could reach it. And then time swallowed it. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Languages died, kings and rulers vanished, wars came and went, civilizations transformed, but the gospel slept, untouched, unread, waiting. Until the day the cave cracked open and the manuscript breathed air again. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The very gospel that warned about power, pride, and the distortion of truth survived, not because powerful people protected it, but because ordinary people, quiet people, unseen people, kept it alive. People who understood exactly what Jesus had tried to teach, that the kingdom was never built by institutions, it was built by hearts. And the manuscript survived because those hearts refused to let the message die. But now that we've seen how it survived, the question becomes, what is the message it carried? What truth did this gospel protect so fiercely that people risked their lives for centuries? Everything up to this point, the hidden disciple, the emotional confessions, the dangerous teachings, the conflict with early leaders, the centuries of secret guardians, all of it leads to one question: what was the message this gospel carried? What truth was so powerful, so challenging that some feared it, and others protected it with their lives? When scholars finally pieced the fragments together, they found that the heart of the gospel was not a new miracle, not a secret prophecy, not a hidden doctrine. It was something deeper, something that shook even seasoned historians. The lost gospel revealed a side of Jesus that rarely made it into official writings, not because it contradicted anything, but because it demanded something of believers that institutions could not control. It revealed a Jesus who cared more about inner transformation than outward obedience. It revealed a Jesus who valued the heart more than the rule. It revealed a Jesus who believed every person held divine potential, even the ones society ignored. One passage reads, You search for God in the heavens, but refuse to see him dwelling in yourself. Another follows. The kingdom is not built by hands, but awakened by hearts. This was the message, that God was not distant, not locked in temples, not owned by leaders, not controlled by rituals. God was near. God was here. God was within. And that terrified the early structure, because a faith that lives in the heart cannot be ruled by hierarchy. A kingdom found within cannot be guarded by gates. A God who dwells in everyone cannot be monopolized by anyone. The lost gospel showed Jesus speaking urgently about the danger of confusing holiness with authority. The disciple wrote, "He said to us, 'It is not holy to seek to be higher than your brother. It is holy to lift him above yourself.'" Imagine the power of that message. Imagine how it overturns social order, religious hierarchy, political ambition. Jesus wasn't just trying to rescue people, he was trying to reshape humanity itself. Another fragment reveals one of the most profound teachings recorded. If you want to know God, look for the place in your heart you have not yet forgiven. A message like that doesn't build armies. It builds compassion, it builds humility, it builds responsibility, and that is dangerous to anyone who wants control. But the most powerful passage in the entire manuscript, the one that scholars believe is the centerpiece of the gospel, is this: love is not the path to God. Love is God, and whoever lives in love has already found the kingdom. This message is simple, but it is explosive. It means the kingdom is not a reward. It is a state of being. It is not something you enter after death. It is something you awaken in life. It means salvation is not owned by doctrine. It is lived through compassion. It means the presence of God is not limited to places of worship. It breathes in every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every step toward understanding. And this is where the lost gospel goes even further, into a truth so intimate early leaders may have feared it would cause chaos. Jesus saw himself not as someone to be worshipped from afar, but as someone showing humanity what they could become. The disciple wrote, "He told me, 'Do not marvel at what I do, marvel at what you are capable of.'" This changes everything. It doesn't diminish Jesus. It elevates humanity. It doesn't reduce his divinity. It expands our possibility. It doesn't threaten faith. It deepens it. This was the message preserved for centuries. The message hidden, guarded, protected. The message the disciple feared would be lost, yet trusted would one day be needed. A message that tells us, you are not distant from God. You are not unworthy of God. You are not outside the kingdom. You are the place where God chooses to dwell. That is what the lost gospel reveals, and that is why it survived. But there is one final truth. A closing revelation the disciple wrote with trembling hands, knowing it might be his last entry. A truth that changes how the entire gospel is understood. The final revelation. What this means for us today. After all the fragments, the private teachings, the intimate confessions, the hidden warnings, the courageous guardianship, the manuscript ends with words that feel like a whisper across centuries. The disciple, old and tired, knowing his time was almost finished, wrote one final reflection. Not a doctrine, not a command, not a prophecy, a confession. He wrote, "I have feared for many years that these words would never be read. But now I understand that truth does not die when buried. It only waits for a heart willing to receive it." Throughout the manuscript, he described Jesus with a tenderness rare in ancient writings. A man who carried divine purpose, yet bore the overwhelming weight of love. But in this closing passage, the disciple reveals the deepest truth of all. The lost gospel was never meant to expose the church. It was meant to awaken the believer. He wrote, We sought to protect his teachings as if they belonged to us, but his words were never ours to guard. They belong to every soul that longs for the light. This was the heart of the gospel. Not secrecy, not rebellion, not controversy, but awakening. The disciple believed that one day humanity would be ready to read Jesus' most challenging message, the message that scared early leaders, empowered ordinary people, and survived centuries of silence. And that message is this: the kingdom of God is a mirror. What you see in it is what you choose to bring into the world. He explained that Jesus didn't come to create followers who simply repeated his words. He came to create people who lived with the same courage, compassion, and clarity that he lived with. People who saw the divine in themselves. People who saw the divine in others. People who understood that God wasn't far above, but within every act of love. In the final lines of the manuscript, the disciple wrote something so raw, so honest, that scholars fell silent reading it. He said, "I write this for the ones who live in a time I cannot imagine. When fear rises and hearts grow cold, remember this: he did not come to show us what he alone could do. He came to show us what humanity was created for." Imagine that. A Jesus who didn't intend to stand alone in glory, but to lift humanity into the fullness of its purpose. A Jesus who didn't want worship without transformation, who didn't want belief without compassion, who didn't want followers who obeyed, but sons and daughters who loved. The disciple ended with a plea. If these words have reached you, then let them reach further. Do not let the world convince you that the light within you is small. It was placed there by the one who knew what you could become. And just like that, the manuscript ends. No grand conclusion, no theological debate, no final argument. Just a simple, profound reminder that the message of Jesus was never meant to make us smaller. It was meant to make us more alive. When the archaeologists discovered these last lines, one of them reportedly said, "This isn't just a lost gospel. It's a reminder of who we were always meant to be." And maybe that's why the gospel resurfaced now, in our time. A time when the world feels fractured, fear is loud, and love is often the first thing sacrificed. Because perhaps humanity once again needs to hear that divinity lives within us. That compassion is our greatest strength. That love is not weakness. It is the kingdom in motion. And the final question this gospel leaves us with is not, "Why was this hidden?" but, "Now that you know this, what will you do with it?" That is the real mystery. And that is the legacy of the lost gospel of Jesus they didn't want you to know.